Hello and welcome to today's discussion on The Inheritance of Loss by Kiran Desai. This is the second novel by Kiran Desai and it's also a Booker winner. It also had won other significant awards such as the National Book Critics Circle Fiction Award and Vodafone Crossword Book Award. This novel is set in the mid-1980s and it is about migration. There are two important characters in this work, Biju and Sai. Sai is an Anglicized Indian girl. She lives in Kalimpong with Jemubai, her grandfather, who also is Western educated. And there's also a dog named Mutt. Biju, on the other hand, is an illegal Indian immigrant. He's living in the US. He's also the son of a cook who works for Sai's grandfather. That's the connection between Sai and Biju. The narration throughout the novel, it shifts between these 2 points of view. Some of the major themes that this novel discusses include the idea of social class and how class becomes important in defining relationships, trust, and even dictating the behavior of individual characters. We also find this tussle between Indian and the Western, not always necessarily as dichotomous things, but we also find certain characters such as the grandfather straddling two worlds, trying to negotiate the ambivalence and the relation. There are themes of colonialism and globalization where they inform each other and also are presented as two ideas which are poles apart. The difference between poverty and privilege comes across as being significant because we are also being introduced to the story of two characters who belong to totally different social classes, where one is informed by poverty and the many difficulties of it. We find the other inhabiting a privileged status. There are also discussions about home and the idea of belonging, since there are two characters who are placed in two different ends of the spectrum. One, an illegal immigrant in a Western land, the other being at home, but at the same time being influenced and nurtured by predominantly Western values. I found this interesting research work by Cecil Mary Lone, published from the University of Oslo in 2018, where she looks at the idea of race in the inheritance of loss. She argues that the division between Sai and Gyan can be seen as more ethnic than racial, but at the same time, due to the colonial influence and the ways in which the class system works, we find it making its way into the lives of the characters as well. The experiences that Jemubai, the grandfather of Sai, underwent as a youth in England, we find that it has immense potential to expand the theme of race into a universal subject. In this thesis, we find this argument that the reader recognizes a pattern of white imperial superiority and power, and how people from colonized countries are not accepted or welcomed into the Western world. And this is the dichotomy that Desai introduces us to when she is talking about two characters who are ethnically the same, but their lived experiences are so different that we find them being subjected to many colonial ideas in different ways. Looking at Jemubai as an important character in the discussion on race, we can find that in 1939 he moves to Cambridge in England, which is where he begins to learn hate and racism. The experience of racism that he faced in England, it changed his personality and his outlook completely. Earlier in the novel itself, we are told that never again would he know love for a human being that wasn't adulterated by another contradictory emotion. And later on, it talks about how eventually he felt barely human at all. Here, race comes in as an intervention which transforms this individual, who in a different part of the world is located within a privileged sector, who in a different part of the world enjoys certain kinds of powers over the other subalterns who are around. So this thesis talks about the peculiar ways in which we find race penetrating into different ethnic groups, into different social classes. And this is a novel which also exposes the identity problems in post-colonial India, situating the relation between Sai and the cook. We get to know that poverty and privilege are being positioned, are being represented here and the way they deal with each other, the way these two otherwise nice characters deal with each other, they also expose certain problems which are prevalent in contemporary India. At the outset of the novel itself, we are being made privy to the very different kind of relation that they share. Sai felt embarrassed. She was rarely in the cook's hut, and when she did come searching for him and enter, he was ill at ease, and so was she. Something about their closeness being exposed in the end as fake, their friendship composed of shallow things conducted in broken language. For she was an English speaker and he was a Hindi speaker. In spite of sharing the same ethnicity, we find them being totally different in terms of language, in terms of identity, in terms of the culture and the privilege of the lack of it that they have. So these two characters who come across as interesting, Uncle Potty and Father Booty, both of them represent the privileged people from the West who choose to live in India. The novel also tells us that they make this choice of living in India because their economic status had begun to fade away, and they chose to be in a place where they would continue to enjoy certain privileges than going back to their Western first world nations, where they would perhaps be not able to enjoy the kind of privileges that they would get in a third world, seemingly backward country. Uncle Potty is from a typical English upper class. He is Oxford educated. We get to know that his parents were very rich. His mother even made a trip to Switzerland just to see the cherry blossoms. So that's a kind of background from which he comes. And Father Booty is from Switzerland. He is from a privileged European family as well. He is from a privileged European family as well. Both of them are experiencing a fading economic status, which could be seen as an extension of the fading colonial power. Uncle Potty and Father Booty, they continue to be rich and powerful compared to the other poor, the other underprivileged in Kalimpong, and they seem to be quite comfortable with that status of privilege that they enjoy only in a nation which is not really their own, only in a setting which is not ethnically their own. And when we look at a comparative study between Father Booty and Biju, who is an illegal immigrant in the US, we realize that their immigrant experiences are entirely different. They have very little in common except that both are immigrants. Biju faces a tough life in the US on account mainly of his illegal status as an immigrant, but Uncle Potty and Father Booty, though their economic status is not very impressive, we do not find them facing the kind of challenges that Biju is facing in the US. Here also we find class, race and its peculiar context and situationing coming into play a significant role in determining the lived experiences of an individual. I leave you with this brief statement to think about as and when you begin reading this novel. In The Inheritance of Loss, several characters are victims of discrimination. Still, they are discriminating others. It keeps a hierarchy based on races and ethnicity going. Illustrates a categorization according to ability and status, and also a power structure. In practical terms, this means that in order to work oneself up in the hierarchy, one has to press someone else down or aside. That seemed to be the central theme around which different characters and events are plotted in this wonderfully crafted novel, The Inheritance of Loss. I now also invite one of our students, Ranjani, to speak at length about how this novel can be situated in the larger framework of the body of writing that we refer to as Indian writing in English. I thank you for listening.
Good morning, I am Ranjani and I will be presenting on the topic Dawn of the New Indian Novel in English, and it is an analysis of novels post Midnight Children with focus on The Inheritance of Loss. So, as one of the final presenters in this course, as perhaps the penultimate presenter in this course, I think this topic is somewhat an encapsulation or a summary of most of what we have done in this course, or I hope it will be rather. So, my objectives in this presentation are to trace the change in the preoccupations of the Indian novel in English since Midnight's Children, and to identify the inheritance of loss as part of this changing literary trend. So, my analysis today will be rather non-traditional in that I will not be looking directly at themes or as at style of narration and so on, but see them more as part of my objective, which is to identify the inheritance of loss as part of literary school. And another thing is that I draw heavily from the works of Rajeshwari Sundararajan for at least 1/3 of my presentation, and that is largely due to the fact that I could not find too much critical material to support my presentation. Having said that, the remainder of my presentation is something of a speculative effort in trying to determine the popularity of or lack thereof of the inheritance of loss, and to provide a sort of comparative study between this Booker winner and perhaps other Booker winners. So, Inheritance of Loss won the Booker in 2006. So, I begin with the topic, the burden of the nation. So, writers are burdened with a higher degree of self-awareness. So, burden, when I mention here, in part refers to the content of a novel, and the awareness that I speak about is generated when a relationship is established between the writer and the subject, and this awareness of responsibility also opens up a range of attitudes, opinions, ideologies and questions that need to be addressed. So, this is the burden that I speak about. The next thing is the guardianship of tradition that seems to have suddenly befallen the Indian writer. So, writers seem to have internalized this sense of entitlement, and this is also compounded by the aforementioned burden, and they are acutely aware of their centrality to the nation. They see themselves as intellectual leaders or prophets in modernity. So, one question that I could perhaps pose to these writers is, how does one write a nationwide novel or a nation level novel? And the answer that would seem most obvious to these writers perhaps is that a nation level novel should reflect a dominant perspective, and therefore the writer should hail from a dominant class representing these dominant points of view. So, coming to the next point, realignment of power in the Indian polity and a subsequent weakening of the centre. So, I talk about the socio-political developments that took place after Midnight's Children was published, or the things that occurred during that time. And when I speak of these changes, I refer to the vote bank civilization that came into existence, or the change in women's roles, caste mobilization and a privatization of resources. So, to help you understand better, here are some examples. So, the first one is the Stoic diagnosis of history is against our class in Vikram Seth's A Suitable Boy, which was published in 93. So, this is actually said by a Nawab Sahib, a certain Nawab Sahib in A Suitable Boy, where he refers to the passing of the Zamindar Abolition Act. I should remind you here that this was set in the context of the 1950s. So, in that time the abolition of the Zamindar Act was seen as a sort of curbing of power of these people, and so therefore he pronounces very stoically that history is against our class. And then the mocking of Oxford educated Indians, including herself, as irrelevant Indians in Sagarika Ghosh's Gin Drinkers, published in 2000. Finally, the writers must yield to the new and newly relevant Indians who are now the upwardly mobile Dalit intellectuals and the vulgar entrepreneurs. So, this I take from Rajeshwari Sundararajan. So, it is observed that these things are very revealing of one's relevance in the nation and to the nation, and lay open further questions about the relevance in the context of the nation. And these are the generational changes that are also observed in Kiran Desai, wherein she conveys in the title itself the inheritance of loss. So, loss of power of the ruling class, is this an overstatement? An awareness of change in status does not necessarily imply complete loss of power. So, as I mentioned about Sagarika Ghosh's novel Gin Drinkers, so it records an acute awareness of the change in status and the change in power, and it is an acknowledgement and an awareness. But never is there a sort of lamentation of the passing of this kind of rule of the dominant class. And in the novel, the members of the versatile class are seen to reinvent themselves as allies of the new meritocracy, and they always find some use for their English education. So, this class never becomes irrelevant as it is made to be, but actually keeps reinventing itself to keep itself relevant. The next question is, can a redundancy in the task of nation building be observed? How does this affect the ruling class? And then Satish Deshpande adds to this by saying, from its position as a proxy for the nation, this class has now graduated to thinking of itself as a portrait of the nation. And he also further adds that there has been no diminution of its importance in the era of globalization. So, now I talk about a new patriotism. So, we must at the outset acknowledge that there is a difference in the kind of patriotism, that high-minded patriotism that must be employed in a country when it is on the brink of development, or when it is just newly decolonized, as opposed to a country that sees itself as on the brink of claiming global power, or of becoming an economic and military superpower, and seen as being in part of the transition to getting there. So the kind of high-minded patriotism would not work in a situation like this. So Sundararajan once again says that India is now a big as well as a bad nation, and there is a habit of claiming nationalism by some dominant groups within the country. So opposing the nation or opposing this nation is a new form of patriotism. As said by Arundhati Roy, I secede, hereby declare myself an independent, mobile republic. So this expression of secession has been seen by many critics, including Amitabha Kumar, as an instance of narrow individualism or as a sort of selfish attitude that excludes and leaves people behind. And Sundararajan opposes this by saying that perhaps Arundhati Roy is not disidentifying herself with the nation or removing herself from the nation, but actually hyper-identifying herself with the nation, and that is what is causing the problem here. So the last point is the critique of nationalism always expressed in the voice of an individual. So as we can see, the critique is expressed in the language of individualism and is typically formed through a rejection of compulsory nationalism. So I'd like to prompt a slightly controversial question here, that is, if many of us had not been born into the national identity in which we have been born, how different would our lives be? Or to put it in another sense, how important is our national identity to us and how do we understand it? So perhaps for those of us such as myself who are looking for answers to questions like this, we can find some sense in the words of Shuddhabrata Sengupta, who says in his piece, which is actually subtitled The Confessions of an Anti-National, in which he defines national identity as a limited choice, a great deal of coercion, considerable indifference and some convenience. So these thoughts are also seen to echo not only in his works, but also in the works of Upamanyu Chatterjee in English August and Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children. So what can we conclude about nationality in the end? We have to acknowledge to some extent that choosing nationality is a luxury of the privileged cosmopolitan, even in an age, particularly in an age of globalization, where our identity, national identity, is almost synonymous with our passport. And I'd like to end this segment by just quoting Shama Fuletali when she says in The Idea of India that all we ever thought about India is that we have to live in it. So now I come to the inheritance of loss, and I try to locate this as part of the larger literary canon in Indian writing. So the first point is, it is an intelligently post-colonial novel and provides an unusual post-colonial setting. So it is set in the decaying house of Cho Oyu in Darjeeling, and it has all the quintessential Raj leftovers and is suffering from the cliched colonial hangover that we speak of, something that we could also perhaps identify in Ruth Prawar Jabwala's works. So it provides ample cross-cultural contrasts and has a sensitive handling of tension and violence. So it has all the right elements of a young girl of 16 contrasted with an anglicized grandfather, a well-educated but powerless Nepali tutor. So these are some elements that are interesting in the novel that perhaps make it gives us a better understanding of cross-cultural contrast. So in this, I briefly take you through the characters in the novel before I delve into an analysis. So I begin with Sai. Sai is 16 years. She comes to live with Judge Jemubai Patel when she is orphaned at 9, and her parents died in Moscow. So she becomes close to Gyan, a Nepali mathematics tutor who is hired to teach her. So Sai, her worldview and her world in itself begins to shift once she meets Gyan. And Gyan is an educated man but hails from a poor and uneducated family. The next character is Judge Jemubai Patel, who is an Anglophile, a Cambridge educated judge, is left to care for the child he has never fully known, has a tortured marriage, is alienated from his world, is only close to his dog. He never bestows the same affection that he bestows on his dog to any human, is never friendly with the cook. So he is retired from the Indian civil service, he is an angry old man and has a battered relationship in which he is very abusive to his wife. The next character is the cook, who in odd hilarity is actually only referred to throughout the novel as the cook. And he lives in a hut near the judge's house and is kept on meagre wages. He is tremendously proud of his son Biju, whom he imagines to be wildly successful in America. I should add that the cook is Nepali and has struggled a great deal to send his son abroad. So Biju, the final character, So he struggles from job to job as an illegal immigrant in New York City, suffers a series of humiliations and trials as he tries to survive in New York, returns to Kalimpong when he hears of the political disturbances. So Biju here is a site of analyzing a lot of cultural shock. He undergoes a lot of changes in his worldview, especially when he sees Hindus eating beef, which really appalls him, and he is really awed by the whites but prejudiced against Africans. And he also goes as far as asking Hindus why they are celebrating Christmas in New York when it never possibly occurred to them to celebrate Eid, Guru Nanak or Tibetan New Year. So this is seen as something which really shocks him, but in response to this he is actually told that anybody can celebrate whatever they want as long as it makes them feel good. And here is where he is made to feel like an anti-secular and an anti-Gandhian. So that brings us to the final character in this novel, who is never really a character, but I feel is essential to be acknowledged in a course like this, which is Gandhi. So Gandhi doesn't really have a dominant role or any significant role in this novel, but they refer to Jemubai's nationality by way of expressing his relationship with Gandhi. They refer to his country as the land from which Gandhi came. And similarly, the Indian cafe in which Biju works in New York City is called Gandhi Cafe. So Gandhi is present in the novel, but maybe not so in not very obvious way. So I think this is the best expression of the entire, this excerpt encapsulates whatever the gist of this novel is and tries to convey everything that I am trying to convey in the presentation, as well as provides an insight into the book. I request you to read from Superb Writer. So in the second line, it won't last the month, I won't last the month, almost through, she thumped a bend in the river, uphill task. So in this, Kiran Desai is actually taking a very cheeky jibe at V.S. Naipaul, who is the author of A Bend in the River. So Noni says, superb writer, first class, one of the best books I've read. But the response to this is what is more interesting. Oh, I don't know. I think he's strange, stuck in the past. He has not progressed. Colonial neurosis. He's never freed himself from it. Quite a different thing now. In fact, chicken tikka masala has replaced fish and chips as #1 takeout dinner in Britain. It was just reported in the Indian Express. So this shows a sort of generational shift that's been observed not just in this novel, but from the novels that have been published since Midnight's Children. So what really sets the Inheritance of Loss apart? So one critic calls it the trial, says that it portrays a trial of exile, while another adds the world as viewed through the eyes of children and anti-Americanism. So this transition that Biju undergoes from seeing the American dream as an American dream to an American nightmare is something very interesting. And further, I'd like to explain the meaning of workman-like in this context. So workman-like implies that it is efficient and it is competent, but perhaps not very inspiring. For instance, Eileen Battersby, a commentator at the Irish Times, characterizes Desai's work as solid, workman-like, earnest, traditional, and she judged that this year's book is one of the more low-key ones. And Mosley talks about it in his paper as an exactitude of freshness that resists melodrama. So this would be my concluding slide. I would like to point out a couple of things here. The novel does not directly engage with religion or caste, and it's a topic of sensitivity within the Indian discourse. So the word religion and caste together appear in the novel a grand total of 6 or 7 times put together. I do not mean to say that the number of times the word is mentioned in a novel is indicative of the relevance to the novel, but in the context in which these words are mentioned themselves are not very controversial, or it is just mentioned in passing, they are not mentioned as an area of focus. So that's the first thing, and removed perhaps from the political center of Indian writing. So Inheritance of Loss talks about the struggle of Gorkhas and Nepalis, and the place it is set geographically also, it's set in this place called Kalimpong, which is a town in the foothills of the Himalayan foothills of West Bengal, and it is actually removed from both the political and geographical center of Indian writing. Then the third, another point I'd like to make is that the Nepalis who actually read this novel argued that the rebellion has been glorified as projected more as more important than it really is, because it is actually seen as a matter of annoyance or inconvenience to the residents than as a matter of rebellion. And another thing that I found interesting in this novel is that it provides an immediate critique of economic globalization. So, Desai argues, the novel argues that multiculturalism confined to the Western world in this context doesn't begin to address the causes of extremism and violence in the modern world. So, it does have underlying themes that are very relevant even today. But a final thing that I really like to talk about is how it elicited more response from Nepali readers than from Indian readers. So, a lot of Nepalis were actually slightly offended, for the lack of a better word, at the portrayal of Gyan. So, Gyan is a mathematics tutor who comes and teaches Sai, but in some other parts, other Nepalis are portrayed as barbaric or as having low sensibilities. But it is ironic because Gyan is actually being portrayed as a maths tutor. He is not portrayed as a barbaric person, but as a person who is educated and willing to educate another person. So, here is where another prominent question is posed, that is, if for instance this is an easy novel for an Indian reader because it is an Indian writing about a Nepali. Nepali readers ask, suppose a Nepali writer had written about Indians in a similar way, would it have been easy for this Nepali writer to get away with it? So, this kind of brings to fore the notion that perhaps Indian writers do hold a position of privilege, perhaps at least in the South Asian context, and that we are not all that deprived of power. So, that I would like to conclude my presentation.